Hello, everybody, and welcome to another adventure in history. It's been an odd day, and I am not on my game, as they say. I've had some weird stomach and blood pressure stuff going on today. Who knows? I suspect it's because I have not been eating regularly. That's part of the issue. Usually, if I don't eat on a very regular schedule, everything gets thrown out of whack, and then stuff starts affecting the way that I feel, But hope you're doing well. Matt, good to see you. DCI Banks, as always, welcome in. Hope things are doing well in your necks of the woods. Not doing horribly, I just feel odd, and that has kept me from doing things that I sort of needed to do. I'm behind on some stuff I'm not really behind on anything. I'm sort of behind on things that I wanted to do myself. Like I really wanted to fix all of these alerts on Streamlabs today, and I ended up basically lying on the bed listening to an audiobook because I just got really sick to my stomach and felt like if I moved too much I was going to puke, which is not very common for me. I don't usually feel that way. So welcome. It's me getting old, right? I turned 4. Maybe I'm pregnant. It could be. It could be. I have been a little bit emotional lately, and I have put on a little bit of weight, so it could be pregnant. I need to get one of the at-home pregnancy tests, and we'll see how that goes. You know how it is. We all gotta take the lumps when you get them, right? But it is viewer request night, and this is one that I'm very excited about talking over because it's an interesting period of time that a lot of people know about, sort of because they can tell you that it happened. But if you ask them, hey, what years were involved in the Crimean War, they couldn't tell you. And who were the people that fought in the Crimean War? They couldn't tell you. And why was the Crimean War fought? And they couldn't tell you. It's one of those weird things where we have this sort of fuzzy background idea that there was such a thing, but we couldn't really tell you very much about it, other than the fact that it's something about the Crimean Peninsula, right? So hopefully we will be able to demystify the whole purpose of the war, why we fought it, why people were involved, and talk a little bit more about about what's actually going on. I have heard that there was a thing called the Crimean War. What's up, Green Herring? And welcome in, Diviner. Welcome in. Yeah, that's sort of the way that a lot of people approach this. Like, it was a thing. So, I know I got started a little bit late. I didn't turn the now streaming things on until right at about 7. So we'll. You've read about this in the Erie Affair. Okay. I love hearing about one of our vast victories. Oh, yeah. The one where it was so unpopular at home that the everybody but the Prime Minister wanted to bail out. What's up, Cliff? 1850s and their mother, and what was that last question? It is that way sometimes. So, all right. I guess if we want to, we can go ahead and kick off the discussion. We do have a lot to cover, mostly because I probably go way too far into background, but I'm going to, right? It's really hard to ask me an easy question and get an easy answer out of it. I tend to talk too much, but, So first off, let us look at the mess that is Europe in 1853. This is Europe in 1853. You're like, what in the devil is that? Exactly. That's exactly what you should have said, because that's pretty much exactly the way that we think about it historically as well. It's a mess. That's what it is. There are lots of different boundaries. Most notably, we're missing really big things like Greece and Italy. Yeah, I'm sorry, not Greece, Germany and Italy. Yeah, Greece had become independent in the 1820s. So mostly with the help of the British, and we'll briefly discuss that tonight because that sort of plays into the background of what we're talking about. But a few things, and a few of the big things that we want to point out. Number one, Ottoman Empire, still really big, and we can see a few things here that are important to point out. Wallachia, Ottoman vassal. Moldavia, Ottoman vassal. These two things especially are going to be important here in just a second. We can see here the position of the Austrian Empire. That's an important thing because that's going to play into some of the discussion we have tonight. And we can see the really big Russian Empire. We don't have... Well, I mean, we have a region that we refer to as Poland, but it's not an independent country. We don't have a unified Germany. We do not have a unified Italy. So, this is what we're dealing with, and this is going to be an important part of it because land and position are going to be the big deal. Cheeky little Sardinia still there? Yeah. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Was Turkey considered the sick man of Europe yet at this time? Aha! Now we are approaching the beginning of the matter. And the beginning of the matter is a really big question about European balance of power. And the balance of power is between what's going to go down in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Specifically, the region that is currently being controlled by the Ottoman Empire. What are we going to do with that? Well, that's the question. The Ottoman Empire had been fairly steadily contracting, and the Russian Empire had been fairly steadily expanding. And for a long time, the Western European powers were kind of okay with Russia getting bigger because they were Christian and the Ottomans were Muslim, and that absolutely played into it. What's up, Cindy Semiotics? Good to see you, my friend. Welcome in. So most of Western Europe is kind of okay with Russia getting bigger for a while, but eventually it becomes fairly evident that Russia wants to take over everything. And this is a problematic issue, especially when Russia starts running afoul of our other large empires, because we have the British Empire and the French Empire and the Spanish Empire. And this is not just running afoul of the big empires in Europe or Western Asia. This is running afoul of these big empires all over the place. In the Pacific, in places like China, Russia is trying to get its fingers into all of the pies. And this bothers especially Britain and especially France, because while they see Russia as a bit of a sort of lumbering younger cousin, they don't necessarily view them super positively. The empire's just recovered from Napoleon times. No, so in the early 1900s, yes, Napoleon and his whole thing is going to pretty much get done by the early 1800s, and we are now post-Congress of Vienna, and all of the big rulers and nobility have basically taken back over their territorial holdings. So, we're going to go over like who's in control of these countries in just a bit. Wanted to do right now is just sort of give like a lay of the land, quite literally show you a map and then talk about the lay of the land. But anyway, Russia and the Ottoman Empire are going to be what is the best example of mortal enemies that we can probably get at this point. They're fighting more than the British and the French are at this point. And everybody knows that Britain and France fought every chance that they possibly could. But the Russians and the Turks had a series of 9 really large conflicts that started off all the way back in 1568 and went all the way up to 1829. So these were the 9 Russo-Turkish wars, and Russia had won almost all of them, and Russia, in many of these cases, had actually received aid from either Britain or France or perhaps Austria or sometimes some German people or maybe some Italian people. Because again, here they're defeating Ottomans, and this is good because we are expanding Christian territory. But it gets to a point in the early 1830s and 1840s that stuff is going to go a bit sideways. And Russia is going to sort of tip its hand, and the people in Western Europe are going to recognize that it's probably not as much of a good idea to have this giant juggernaut of Russia controlling everything. And that's a big deal. These big global empires are being threatened by Russian expansion, and the stability of the Balkan Peninsula is a big question mark, right? If the Ottoman Empire falls, who gets the Balkans? Now, everybody in the Balkan territory says, duh, we get our own territory, we should be independent. And ha ha ha, you know that's going to be the case, right? Well, the Austrians say we should run them, but then there are British and French that say, but what about us? We should get some of that tasty, tasty Balkan territory. And it's a big mess. Russia, of course, sees themselves as the most logical owner and runner of the Balkan Peninsula because there are Slavic people in the Balkan Peninsula, and Russia, of course, is Slavic as well, and they should run all of the Slavic peoples. Doesn't matter if those Slavic peoples think that they're Slavic, actually are Slavic, or want to be run by the Russians in the first place. Nobody cares, right? LOL, Napoleon and his whole thing. Yeah. Napoleon is a big, big deal and changed the course of global history, but for the purposes of tonight, we're going to just relegate him to a footnote. If we want to come back and talk about Napoleon, we totally can do that. What's up, Tuna? Yeah, some of them are, but some of them are very much not Slavic, right? There's also a big and growing question about how to handle Christianity. And this is going to become a big question, most notably because Christians inside of the Ottoman Empire are going to start having some really big gripes with the Ottoman Empire. Now, to be fair, Christians had always been a second-tier citizen in the Ottoman Empire, going all the way back to when the Ottomans first started. Now, they weren't treated as bad as non-Judeo-Christian or non-Abrahamic religions, but they were still taxed differently. They were not allowed to participate in large levels of the government. They, of course, were also kidnapped at a frequent rate and put into slavery or forced into the military, or then pressured very heavily to convert. So Christianity under the Ottomans had always been a question, but there are going to be some really big issues. And to sort of explain this, I found a really great map. And you're like, oh, wait, Shane found a map. Ha, ha, ha. Napoleon Dynamite deserves his own stream? No, not the case. So what we're looking at here is a map of the Ottoman Empire, and we're looking at them 1844 to 1856. So this is going to cover our time period of the Crimean War, and the green stuff is Muslim people, but the purple stuff is Christian communities. And you can see that especially in the Balkan Peninsula and on the islands in the Aegean and the Mediterranean, the populations are going to be overwhelmingly Christian communities. Yada, 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 the best parts. If it's not too interruptive, can I address the presence of Christians in Iran? Is that related? So the Christians in Iran are going to be a much smaller population contemporarily. If we're looking at the 1800s, there are going to be Christians in Iran, but thank you so much for the sub, and I apologize that my subscription animations are not doing what they're supposed to. Streamlabs has had an absolute bork and has pretty much screwed up all of the alerts. But Cine Semiotics, thank you so much for being Spartacus. I'm Spartacus too. So this time period, if we're looking at the early and mid 1800s, there are Christians in Iran. Their situation is not going to be the same situation that we're looking at with the Ottomans, most notably because Persia at this time is independent, and Persia is on much better dealing and much better communication levels with Western Europe. And the Christians there, while being a minority, are not going to be facing overall the same level of negative attention that the Christians, especially in a few regions of the Ottoman Empire, are going to be facing. Today, of course, the population of Christians in Iran is very, very small and has been decreasing, especially after the Iranian Revolution in the 70s, where they, of course, put in a theocratic Iranian government that very strongly promotes Islam and does not like pretty much any other ethnic minority. And this includes Christians, Jewish people, and Zoroastrians. A lot of Zoroastrians that are still practicing in the world are, of course, still in Iran, which is sort of the native homeland of their religion in the first place. Persia is on better footings because of their rugs. Moose, that's pretty great. I appreciate that very much. Anyway, we're looking at Christian diversity. Sydney Semiotics, did that answer your question? Feel free to come back and clarify if you would like. I'd have to get a little bit more specific if you had anything specific more. Actually, also Arabs. Does that mean what was the situation with Arabs in the Ottoman Empire or the Arabs in Persia? Arabs in the Ottoman Empire were a much larger minority, and in some places were the actual majority, especially over here with this region of Mesopotamia, where modern-day Iraq is. A lot of these people would have absolutely identified as Arab prior to being, before they were going to say that they were Turkish. The concentration of Arab people, of course, is going to lessen the further you get away from this region right here. This region right here is sort of it's not the native homeland of the Turkish people, but when the Ottoman Empire was founded and expanded, this was the sort of homeland of the original Ottoman Empire when it was started under Osman and then his sons. So the Turkish population is going to become a less and lower density as you move this way. Of course, you're going to run into Kurdish people and Armenian people. And contemporarily, when we're talking about the 1800s, there would have been much higher percentage of Armenian people up this way. Arabs are going to start. It depends on whether or not you're going to differentiate populations here in Syria as Arab or not. Some of those people do. Some of those people don't. There are going to be Druze people that are, of course, in this region right here. Ethnic Druze people typically have a higher likelihood of being Christian than being Muslim. And you're going to start seeing a lot more Arabic people as you move down this way and as you move down this way. Over in Iran, the Arab population was never particularly high, even when they were being controlled by Umayyads or the early Caliphate, the Rashidun Caliphate, or even then under like the Abbasids. The population of Arabs in Iran was only typically going to be like the ruling class, and a lot of the people that were moved in to be governors and things like that. The big cities and the habitation centers in Iran itself are still going to have very small ethnic Arab minorities, but they're probably not going to be. I don't know if I would get, like, I don't actually know the percentage of Arab people in Iran today, but if I had to guess, I would say it's either close to or less than 10%. But that's just a straight up guess. I don't actually know, so don't like quote me on that. I guess we could Google it if we needed to. Yeah, Kurds, absolutely. You're half Arab, and there's some known tensions with Persian ideology. Yeah. So a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Persian population was not original to Islam itself. It was a predominantly Arab religion when it was founded by Muhammad, and under the early caliphate, it was pretty much all Arab. And then when it expanded, the areas that frequently gave it the most trouble were places that weren't as amenable to Arab and Muslim identity. Now, Iran, of course, does manage to mostly convert to Islam, but even if you look today, one of the biggest differences between places like Saudi Arabia and Iran are their particular interpretations of Islam. So if we look at populations of Muslims across the world, the vast majority are going to be Sunni Muslims, which would be more reflected with the population of Saudi Arabia, whereas Iran is one of the larger Shia nations on earth. So even today, they're still Islamic, but there's still some tension between Iranian people and Arabic people. And this goes back to a lot of different historical things. Of course, most recently when we have big wars between places like Iraq and Iran, and that spurs whole invasions of places like Kuwait and all of that fun stuff. So fun being sarcastic here. Obviously, war is not fun. But I hope that answered your question. I'd be happy to ramble more. If you have more specific, you can give me a little bit more guidance. Iran has very strong legacy of its own and is geographically mountain dense, so they don't change very easily. That's a fair point. The geography of Iran is definitely one that is not necessarily immediately open. Once you can get up onto the plateau, your big Iranian plateau, you can still see how rough it is even on top of the plateau. But, once you get up there, you can move around fairly easily. But most of the big shipping routes and trade routes are still along the coast of the Caspian, along the coast of the Persian Gulf here. The ones that come out of this region, you can even see where you might build a natural trade route, like right here along the edge of the plateau. That's the old Persian Royal Road that would have gone down here to places like Susa, up into but this is, of course, going all the way back to Persia, like Iron Age Persia. So, yeah, I can ramble about pretty much anything. If that didn't answer the question, I'd be happy to go. War in the Middle East, I think we can always blame Britain for every aspect of the mess. Not every aspect of it, because war has been going on in the Middle East for thousands of years prior to Britain even being an idea. If we're talking about modern wars in the Middle East, you also have to throw in France and the United States for that. Yeah. And yeah, this is a tangent-friendly place. We can tangent forever. Endless tangents. Well, not endless tangents. Eventually, my voice will give out. And we can still blame them for the wars prior to Britain's existence. Nah, we can't do that. The British definitely didn't fix things. Well, the post-World War I stuff is a big mess. Obviously, a lot of the stuff with Egypt and the Suez Canal and Crete and Cyprus didn't fix a lot of things. There's plenty of blame to go around, though. It's not like Britain showed up, created tension out of nothing, and then convinced everybody to fight. One of the reasons the British were so impactful in the Middle East is because they were very adept at understanding the existing differences between these people and using those differences as wedges to drive them apart. This is literally exactly what the British did in World War I to finally collapse the Ottoman Empire. They went in and, Arabia has sovereign rule, right? Saudi Arabia exists as a creation of the World War I compromises where the Arabs revolted against the Turks. So does the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, right? That was created as a way to get those people on board. So did Syria, right? Saudi Arabia wasn't under a mandate. Saudi Arabia became independent almost immediately. There was a mandate in Palestine. There was a mandate in Lebanon. And there were mandates in Syria that were under the French that didn't last nearly as long as the British ones. So, of course, the British mandate in Palestine was the one that caused a lot of the consternation that's still rippling today. but they promised all that land. No. The stuff under Lawrence that he promised was not based on exact borders, or like they didn't sit down with the Saudis and draw a map that said that you're going to get like each acre of all of this stuff. It just said that they're going to be given a lot of this territory, and they're going to be sovereign rulers over that by themselves. Not all who speak Arabic are really... that's very true as well. A lot of people speak Arabic out of the ease of doing so because of the... Arabic is the religion of Islam. And so areas that are predominantly Muslim have a history of being exposed to Arabic. And for a long time, Arabic, of course, was the lingua... I almost said lingua franca. Lingua Arabica. It was the language of the government, right? So it became the language that most people spoke to do things like trade, and of course then it just ends up being the national languages of a lot of these countries. Some of the dialects, I don't know if any of the dialects are completely unintelligible. I think that even the strongest dialects, like if you get some of the dialects that are over in northern Morocco and compare them to stuff like Jordanian, they're going to have substantial differences, but I think that they're still going to be like 65-70% overlapping. I don't think any of them get so far that you literally can't understand anybody. I feel like I would know more about this if I actually watched Lawrence of Arabia any of the 10,000 times my dad watched it. The movie itself is interesting and horribly historically inaccurate, so don't don't go there. Your dad doesn't understand Algerian conversation. So Algeria, that might be because I don't know if the people... I don't know. I'd have to be sitting there and listening to it, and I don't know if I have a good enough ear of Arabic to pick it up. You can't understand some people from Louisiana. Maghreb Arabic and Saudi Arabia Arabic is about as diverse. Yeah, I mean, I know that there's a lot of different diversions. There's a lot of different dialects of language. Language doesn't stay the same just because people speak it in different places. It's an evolving and growing thing. This is why Tolkien was so excited about language. And one of the reasons I like language so much, too. Anyway, so the point of me showing you this is to talk a little bit about the Christian situation in the pre-Crimean War period. And the big thing is going to be dealing with who gets to be the sort of guardian of these Christian populations, especially these populations over here. Places like Jerusalem and the sites that were Christian pilgrimage sites over here in the Holy Land, these places and these populations of Christians here in Lebanon and Syria, and then the treatment of Christians over here in the Balkans. These are going to be big question marks, and the questions are going to come down to who these Christians answer to. Do they look towards Western Europe and Catholic Christianity, or do they look towards Russia and Orthodox Christianity? And the question there is a big and powerful one, and it has a lot of implication to it. Of course, Russia wants to be the head of Christianity, but we also have a contender in France. And France, of course, is getting a lot of backing from Italy in this, because if the Roman Catholic Church becomes the sort of overseer or protector of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, that's going to gain them a lot of prestige. And of course, the same is true for the patriarchs in Russia if they manage to convince the Ottomans to allow them to have some level of governance or protection over this. Russia did absolutely want to be the new Rome and considered itself to be the new Rome. This goes all the way back to the fact that the last princess of the Byzantine Empire married the Tsar of Russia. So they had a direct bloodline to the Paleologi family that was the ruler of Byzantine Christianity in the 1450s. But we're to the point where Russia just wants to run everything. Now, the big question here is mostly because there are already going to be really big and very uncomfortable things that have happened between the Ottomans and Christian populations. There have been a lot of tensions over the past couple of hundred years in history between Christians and the Ottomans. Big things that brought ethnic cleansing to mind, things that are going to create giant displacements of people. There are two events that are referred to as the Great Migrations of Serbs. This is going to be the 1680s to 1690s is the first one, and the 1730s to the 1740s is going to be the second one. And these were specifically done because the regional power base of the Ottomans was not comfortable with having such a large population of Christians basically right in their face. So they made it very difficult for these people to live in these areas, and they pushed them out. Once the Greek War of Independence started, the Christians were seen as complicit in aiding these foreign powers at dissolving the Ottoman Empire, because Greece, of course, was predominantly Christian, and the aid that came to Greece to help it become independent were from Christian countries. So this was like a they're out to get us kind of thing. And we end up with events where there are going to be violent uprisings against Christians in the Ottoman Empire. In 1821, there's this big event called the Massacre in Constantinople, where several thousand people that were Christians are going to be the targets of violence, including a lot of deaths. And during and then kind of in the middle of the transition for Greece being independent, the Ottomans are going to go to several of these islands in the Aegean that were in Greek territory that were all Christians, and then pretty much wipe out everybody on these islands. This is going to be pretty bad in 1822 and 1824 especially, and this is very clearly here ethnic cleansing. This is an attempt at getting rid of all of the uprisers, and the people that are going to be targeted for violence here are going to be ethnic Greek Christians that were not happy with being ruled by the Ottomans. What's up, Puckface? How's it going, man? So there's a lot of tension here, and the outside forces want to be ones that can step in and say, no, you can't do that, because if you mess with these Christian communities, we're going to be the ones that are going to step in and back up our Christian brethren. So this wasn't about resources, political, and superiority. This was a pure religious slate clearing. If you're talking about specifically these islands in the Aegean, these Greek islands, that was done for strategic location. Like you can't have islands that are going to be used as bases for your opponents or for rebel forces. So you go onto the island and you kill anybody that's fighting against you, and it just so happens that the battle lines here are drawn very clearly along ethnic and religious lines. It wasn't pure. So they didn't go in and say, we're going to kill every Christian here. They just went in and said, we're going to kill everybody that doesn't stand with us. And that was, pretty much all of the Greek Christians. It was you could hide it behind war if you wanted to, but the outcome was killing all the people on these islands. And we could do the Greek War of Independence as another viewer request if you wanted to, because it's absolutely one that could fill up the whole time period. At the moment we're just trying to explain why the Crimean War broke out. But anyway, what we have here is European outrage. These people in these Western countries and Russia are saying you can't just kill Christians whenever you want to. We need to work out a situation where we can help police some of these sites, and so that we can oversee how the Ottomans deal with Christians in their borders. And of course, the Ottomans are going to see this utterly as an invasion of their sovereignty, and they're going to be very reluctant to let anybody in to a lot of these big places that are predominantly Christian, because the last time that they did that, we end up with Greece becoming independent. So the the problem that the Ottomans are facing is that by this point in time, they're almost effectively out of money, and they're being propped up rather substantially by the British and the French, because the British and the French are trying to keep the Ottomans around so that Russia doesn't expand and take everything over. So there's going to be some negotiation, and this stuff starts in the early 1850s, and the negotiation here is whether or not there are going to be Christian overseers that are going to help police and help deal with and oversee relationships between Ottomans and Christians inside of the Ottoman Empire. Specifically, we're going to be looking at sites in the Holy Land. We're going to be looking at pilgrimage sites, places like Jerusalem and Nazareth, places that are religiously important to Christians and Muslims. So, the British don't really want to go to war here. The British are fine with the Ottomans existing as long as the Ottomans are kind of in their pocket. And the French, of course, want to be the people that are going to be looked towards. Russia, of course, wants to be the country that everybody looks towards. And the Ottomans are not really going to be happy with any of this stuff. But what's going to end up happening is that the British are going to start brokering this deal that would kind of give a little bit of power to the French and a little bit of power to the Russians to try to make everybody happy. And the British ultimately don't really care too terribly much about who does this, because the British, and this is going to sound rough, and it's not necessarily an utterly true case across the board, but in general, the British don't care so much about this overseeing the Christian stuff. The British want to make sure that they can control the region because they want to make sure that they have access to the Suez Canal, and they want to make sure that their empire is in control and manages to keep everything running smoothly. To them, it's more important to come out of this with a peaceful solution than it necessarily is to get anything for Christianity. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their Christian hearts. Which is still why they have bases on Cyprus today, pretty much, right? They don't just have bases on Cyprus, they claim to own part of Cyprus. And of course, the Turks claim that they own part of Cyprus. Cyprus is an interesting place today. It's the only part of Britain where you can still be a citizen of the EU. And you can also have simultaneous EU, British, and Turkish citizenship if you live on the island of Cyprus. It's a fascinating place. And there are very few car rental places that will allow you to drive back and forth between the Turkish and the British parts of the island. I've wanted to go to Cyprus for a long, long time, so I've planned trips there. Cyprus isn't British. Tell that to the British. Cyprus is independent, except for what the British say, and except for what the Turkish say. And I don't... I recognize Cyprus is an autonomous nation, and I think that both the Turks and the British people should allow those people on the island to have autonomy and vote for their own stuff. I know that Cyprus has a capital and a flag and is a nation. But there we go. Anyway. The point here is that the negotiations are going to be tough, and they're not happy, and they're not good, and they don't really like very much of this, and nobody is going to get everything that they want. But the Ottomans are going to end up backing out of the deal. The Russians are playing really, really rough, and they're being typical Russians, and when Russia doesn't get what they want, this is what's going to be the big problem here. So let's take a little bit of time and look at who we're talking about here. So this is sort of your rundown of rulers. All right, so leading the Ottoman Empire at this time, we have a guy named Abdülmecid, who is the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He was a fairly level-headed kind of guy. He was in a rough position mostly because he wanted to be more independent and more powerful than he was capable of being. And the situations previous to him had put him in a really, really rough spot. Here we have Tsar Nicholas I. He is the Tsar of Russia at the time. He very much saw himself as a religious-backed ruler of the population. He's going to be rather Christian. That's going to be a very big driving force for him. Of course, he also wants to rule the entire world, and he was rather successful at expanding the Russian Empire for a portion of his reign. What's up, Tommy? In Britain, we have this guy. We're actually getting to the point where we're going to be able to get some photographs. The British Prime Minister at the time is this dude whose name is Lord Palmerston. His name is actually Henry Temple, but his title is Lord Palmerston. Palmerston is an interesting guy here who is mostly driven by making sure that British money is going to keep coming in from the colonies. And the empire of the British at that time was global, and he's also going to oversee a lot of the stuff that's going on when Britain is fighting in India. If you all were around a few weeks ago when we did the British conquest of India, a lot of that happened under Palmerston's rule. Everybody wants to rule the world. Yeah, we did, right? And here we have Napoleon III, who is the King of France at this time, or I guess you could call him Emperor of France if you want to. Napoleon is an interesting guy, and of the three big European leaders, he has nothing to do with Napoleon Dynamite. That movie has become somewhat the bane of my existence, because you can't say anything about actual historical figures without people making reference to that movie, which, I hate to say it, wasn't as funny as a lot of people think that it is. Right? What up, Cave? Some number sets on the British Empire. Indeed. It's fun. You can be driven by a car, and you can drive a car. So Napoleon here is... Oh, man, he really wants to be Napoleon the First. But he isn't. He very much is not. So, there we go. It's funny if you find it funny. It's not funny if you don't. There are parts of the movie that made me laugh, but I didn't roll in the aisles for that entire movie. I've seen it as many times as I want to. How about that? What up, Tad? How's it going, man? Okay, so when Abdulmajid pulls out of the negotiations for Christian stewardship, this is going to make Nicholas I very, very angry. And what Nicholas I is going to decide to do is, well, we should just directly take over some of this territory. That's what we should really do. And he's going to move into these regions right here. So this is, again, in here, the Balkan Peninsula. If we go back to our map, what he's going to do is move into Moldavia and Wallachia. And they're just going to move into the territory, and they're going to say, okay, this is under our protection now. And it's fair to point out that one of the covers that he has for doing this is that Moldavia and Wallachia both are very high population percentage Christian, and they're also territory that he would love to hold in the first place, because this is going to give him more access to the Balkan Peninsula. Now, when you move into Ottoman territory, this is an act of war, and the Ottomans go, okay, look, dude, we get that you're miffed, that we're not going to just roll over backwards and allow you to run rampant in our sovereign territory. But you can't just take stuff away from it and expect us to be okay with that. Now, this is in July 1853. So Russia is going to occupy Moldavia and Wallachia, and they're just going to say, look, it's ours. We're going to protect our Slavic brethren. We're going to protect the Christians. They show up, and a lot of people there are actually kind of happy to see the Russians, because they're like, hey, we're going to get out from under the Ottomans. But there are fairly sizable populations that are like, what the heck are you doing here? We don't really want you here. And the biggest complainer, other than the Ottoman Empire, who just lost 2 of their vassals, is the Austrians. Because here's Austria, and here's Moldavia, and here's Wallachia. Austria sort of thinks this region should be their territory. So now here comes Russia taking over their territory, and the Austrians go, you all need to go. You need to leave. And Russia's like, not gonna. And this is a very tenuous situation here. The British and the French both say, hey, Russia, you really should back out. That wasn't a cool move. We get that you're ticked, but you really can't do this, right? And Russia's going to be like, Nicholas is very stubborn and thinks that he's got the upper hand here. Because he knows that the British don't want to go to war, and he knows that the French are going to be really hard-pressed to get their armies over to this region, and he knows that the Ottomans are weak. One of the things that had happened as a result of the British and the French continuously bailing out the Ottoman Empire is that the British and the French had imposed military limitations on the Ottomans. And the Ottomans had to decrease the size of their navy, decrease the size of their army. So Russia knew that the Ottomans, they weren't really going to be able to put up much of a fight here. And there were enough locals that were going to welcome the Russians that they could run with this story of locals welcome Russians. You know, pretty much, right? Pretty much. So the Ottomans are going to go kind of one last time. They're going to say, look, you've really got to go. And this is sort of like in August and September. They're going to tell the Russians, look, you really, really got to go. And Russia's not going to go. So the Ottomans reach out to the British and the French and they go, look, we want to declare war on Russia, but we're not going to do that unless you back us up. And the British and the French kind of meet together and they go, do we really want to be backers in what would basically be the 10th Russo-Turkish War? And what Britain and France tell the Ottomans is, look, Abdulmajid, here's the deal. If you declare war on Russia, we will say that we support your war on Russia, but we really don't want to get directly involved in a war with Russia. We don't necessarily want to send guns and ships and troops and things like that. We're not going to declare war ourselves, but if you want to, we'll come out internationally and say, oh yeah, the Ottomans are totally right. We back them. Russia bad. No trade with Russia. Trade with Ottomans. You know, da-da-da-da-da. And that's going to give the Ottomans the cover that they want. Proxy war with Russia. Yeah, exactly, right? And in October 1853, the Ottomans are going to declare war on Russia. Now, Russia expected this, right? They knew what was coming. They knew what was about to happen. So as soon as the Ottomans declare war on Russia, Russia just says, okay, cool, we're going to take everything. And they had this really big army packed up already and run it basically right down the middle of the Balkan Peninsula. And they take the Ottomans pretty much at surprise. And a lot of the stuff that they're sending into the Balkans are these sort of Russian imperial troops that are from all over the place that have grudges against the Ottomans. These are people from the Caucasus Mountains that used to be under the Ottoman control that have like deep-seated hatred of the Ottomans. Christians that had been sort of liberated, if you will, from Ottoman detention are going to be involved in these guys. And they're going to send a lot of these cavalry units in. They're going to roll the Ottomans up pretty fast. And for the first month or so of the war of October, the Russians are going to be really, really, really in control. And a lot of people are like, ooh, this is bad. One of the leaders that made a lot of headway at this time period is this Russian guy. This guy's name is Ivane Andronikovishvili. Ivane. So sorry. Anyway, he's one of the guys that wins some of these wars or one of some of these battles. And what's notable about some of the victories this guy wins, Andronikovishvili. These names are humongous. Anyway, one of the reasons why these guys win, even though they're outnumbered, is because the Russians have big guns. And the Russian war technology at this time period was going to outstrip the Turkish war technology. The Turks are being led at this time mostly by this guy, who's going to be in the overall position of Ottoman military control. This guy's name is Omar Pasha. And Omar Pasha was actually born a Christian. He converted to Islam. And he's going to be pretty much the guy that they're going to rely on for effectively everything. No, they didn't send the Scythians. At this point, the Scythians have been long gone. But Omar Pasha is a really, really smart guy when it comes to strategy. And he's mostly just being outgunned. You can't really win if they can shoot you from further away. And if they can shoot you more accurately from further away. It's really, really hard to kill those people and protect your cities. So Omar Pasha ends up on the back foot. And Russia, in the first month of the war, really feels like they've won it already. They sort of feel like they're going to just end up in Constantinople, and they're going to end up taking the city, and they're going to end up, celebrating Christmas from Hagia Sophia. And one of the things that they decide to do in the same time as they're attacking in the Balkans is send their fleets over here into the Black Sea and start attacking Turkish sites along the northern coast, especially at a place called Sinope. And this is going to be the first really, really big battle of the war. And it's a naval battle where a significantly smaller Russian fleet is going to absolutely wreck the Ottoman fleet. Sinope is a super ancient city that goes all the way back to almost Neolithic times. It's super ancient stuff. But at this point, it was a big Turkish port on the Black Sea, and it was where they kept a lot of their ships. And the big difference here between Russian technology is once again going to be seen because the Russians at this point were using steamships, and they were using ships that had metal plating, and they were using guns that shot exploding shells. So these are different than just regular old cannonballs, right? These were shells that were designed to be packed with explosives and explode on impact. And this is some of the first times that you ever see these particular types of shells being used in warfare, and they are used to devastating effect. The Russians just wipe the floor with the Ottoman fleet at Sinope. And that's disturbing for the Ottomans, obviously, because this was a significant portion of their fleet. Dun 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 dun! Cowboy Gone Insane, thank you so much for that follow, and welcome to the adventure. So, the defeat by itself is bad, but what really sets people off is that after the Russians are done destroying the Turkish fleet, they broadside their ships to the city, and then they start bombarding the city. Now, there were military targets inside of the city, but what ends up happening when you shoot these exploding shells into populated areas is that you start fires and people die that are innocent civilians. And this is going to be a sort of call to arms here. The Russians are going to be very obviously dominating the Turks. They're dominating them in the Balkans. By the time we get to the Battle of Sinope, which is in November, they're dominating them on the sea. And this is just, again, the part of this is because the British and the French had demilitarized the Ottomans so badly, but it's also because the Ottomans were lagging behind in technological advancements. The Turkish ships were still using sails and made out of wood, right? So the level of technology here is just very lopsided. And the Russians are just going to keep racking up wins for all of 1853. We're talking about the Crimean War, Cowboy. What happens is wooden pegs, sails. Yeah, well, A lot of stuff goes bad for this. So when war typically is going to hit a pause during the winter, especially during this time. And over the winter, the British and the French are really having second thoughts about this whole thing. They're especially worried that the Ottomans are just going to fold and that the Russians are going to end up taking all of their territory. And this is exactly what the British and the French didn't want. They wanted the Ottomans around, but they didn't want the Ottomans strong. And they wanted Russia around, but they didn't want Russia in Ottoman territory. And the British and the French at this point are not getting anything that they wanted at all. So by the time we get to 1854, the British and the French are going to use the civilian casualties in the Battle of Sinope as a reason to get involved in the war. So in March, after the end of the winter, when Russia picks right back up and starts expanding again, Britain and France are both going to declare war against Russia. And what's interesting here is that some people say, okay, this is the beginning of the Crimean War, which is dumb because that completely leaves out all of the stuff that had happened in 1853, but whatever. I think it started in 1853. Other people are like, well, it didn't really start until the British and French got involved. I think that's stupid. But anyway, the British and the French are going to start moving troops into the Balkans. And the specific point here is we've got to keep the Russians from being able to roll up the entire Balkan Peninsula. What up, Maddie? So you're saying there was a Crimean War. A pre-Crimean War, a Crimean War, and a post-Crimean War. It's mostly Eurocentric nonsense. That it couldn't have been a war if the British and the French weren't involved, right? Blah, blah, blah. Anti-Crimean War? Yeah. Fun with prefixes, right? Anyway, so the British and the French are going to start moving in soldiers, and this is going to come to a head at a city which is in basically what is modern-day Bulgaria, called Silistra. Crimea War. Yeah. Crimea River. So Silistra is going to be the first place where the Russians are really going to have to start dealing with the fact that the Turks aren't fighting by themselves anymore. The Ottomans are going to be very heavily reinforced at Silistra by the British and the French, and the initial Russian attack on the city is going to fail. This is not something that the Russians had been used to at this particular military conflict, and so they decide that they're going to sit in for a siege. So this siege is going to start in May, and it lasts all the way into June. And what's interesting here is that the Russians probably could have held the siege, but global things are starting to happen here. And the global things that are going to start happening here are going to deal with the fact that the Europeans are going to start pushing pretty hard. Caldillo, welcome in. We've been on stream for an hour, so you've missed the background of the war, you've missed the starting of the war, and you're picking up basically after the first winter of the war. Long story short, Ottomans like being sovereign. Russia wants to get involved. France wants to get involved. Ottomans tell them to bugger off. Russia gets ticked, invades, and then Britain and France get involved to help the Ottomans. That's very, very brief, but pretty much what's going on. Russia could have probably held the siege in Silistra to the point that the British and the French gave up. But there are things moving. Most notably, things are moving along the border between Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, I guess at this point, they're just the Austrian Empire. The Austrians are massing troops along the border to Wallachia and Moldavia, those two territories that Russia took that started the war. And Austria is pretty much telling Russia, you don't get these territories, and if you don't back out of these territories, we are going to invade these territories. And Russia then gets a little skeptical about whether or not they can continue to hold their position in the Balkans if the Austrians are cutting off their supply lines from the north. The British and the French also mobilize a lot more troops than the Russians thought. Russia's like, oh, Britain's fighting all these wars over in India. They're not going to be that big of a threat. The French are wrapped up in other problems. They're not going to be that big of a threat. But Britain and France show up with substantial numbers of troops. So Russia's now like, crap. I guess we kind of have to abandon Silistra. And we have to kind of abandon this Balkan front because we can't hold this position if the British and the French and the Austrians are all fighting us with the Turks over there. So in June, they actually pack up and move back on the northern side of the Danube back into Russian territory. Now, they call this a strategic withdrawal. They go, well, we're doing the right thing. We're still in a good position. We're going to be okay. We're fine. What it really was in their mindset is very different than what it was on the page. What it was on the page is they looked at the forces arrayed against them and they said, we can't beat all these guys, so we got to run away. Now, if you want to say that strategy and withdrawal, sure, but it wasn't like on their terms. Let's be very clear here. The Russians weren't going, well, now that we've shown you, we'll go back home. It wasn't that. That's how they play it, but that's not what it was. But this is pretty much going to end by Silistra. Yeah. What's up next, Lottle? Silistra sounds like a country in a fantasy novel. It kind of does. It's a city in modern-day Bulgaria. Foggage Green, what's up? Bravely ran away, right? Like Sir Robin. But this is going to end the Balkan part of the war. Now, what's interesting is that Russia does give up Wallachia and Moldavia. They move out of that territory, and Austria goes, we'll just hold this for the time being. So Austria moves its troops in to occupy these two zones, and the Ottomans are like, what? And the Austrians go, no. We're just holding the territory for you, and then when everything's cool at the end of the war, we'll give them back. And the Ottomans are like, we don't like you. You should leave too. And the Ottomans even consider invading their own vassals for a little while to try to get their vassals back. But anyway, long story short, Britain goes, okay, cool. Let's just call timeout real quick. And again, the British, they don't really have a lot of dogs in this fight other than we want to make sure Russia doesn't get too big. And now that Russia had moved back into its regular borders and wasn't really going to get any bigger, the British are kind of like, maybe we should just get them to back off. So Britain and France send messages to Nicholas and they say, look, you lost. You should just call this off. And we'll talk the Turks down if you agree to some terms and then bugger off. And Nicholas is like, we strategically withdrew. I don't know what you're talking about. And the British and the French aren't having any of this stuff. They're like, dude, you ran away. Shut up. So Nicholas is like, okay, fine. Send me your terms. And this is where the British and the French really screw up, because Palmerston especially gets a little bit too gung-ho. And Napoleon, of course, thinks that he's in the driver's seat here. And the terms that they send Russia are almost guaranteed no-goes. For example, they have to completely back off any claim south of the Danube and in the Balkans. And Russia's like, we don't really like that. They have to demilitarize the Black Sea. So they have to take all of their warships out of the Black Sea. And Russia's like, we really don't like that either. And then they have to give up any kind of claim over protecting Christian communities in the Ottoman Empire. And Russia's like, how about no to all of those? No to all of those. Do you back off and retreat? Circle yes or no. You can't fire me. I quit. Pretty much, right? Hey, Dame Karen, good to see you. Let me hold this country real quick. Pretty much, right? What did the British and the French think of the Austrians holding more territory? They weren't super fond of it, but the British and the French always looked down their nose at the Habsburgs, who were running the Austrian Empire at the time. They they never really thought that the Habsburgs were going to be able to hold it together. And to be fair, the Austrian Empire was always the weakest of the bunch. The reason it didn't look the weakest of the bunch is because the Western European powers weren't constantly poking at it like they were the Ottomans, right? It's fair to point out that 60 years later, when we get into World War I, one of the least effective armies in the entire portion of World War I is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because they just weren't really as scary as they thought they were. And the French and the British didn't like these guys, and they worried about them from a strategic land position, but ultimately nobody was really staying up at night wondering about the thundering masses of the army of the Austrian Empire, right? But they got that jawline, pretty much. It was the weakest because of the people's not good. Yeah, so the problem with the Austrian Empire was that it was only nominally an empire. It was a group of really, really rich Habsburgs trying to tell about 14 to 15 other ethnic groups that they were the rightful rulers of this territory. And it just never really worked out. But anyway, so they send these overtures to Nicholas, and they say, look, we'll back down. We'll get the Ottomans to back down. You agree to these terms. We'll call it a quits. We'll have ourselves a nice Christmas party. Nicholas says no across the board. Absolutely not. And they get really to the point that they're so offended that they're not even really interested in holding further negotiations. Nicholas pretty much tells them to take their terms and shove them. And at this point, the Allied forces of Britain and France and the Ottoman Empire go, okay, well, if you're not going to quit, how do we accomplish our goals? And the big goal that they could all agree on was, we really don't like the Russians having a fleet in the Black Sea. That bothers us. Bothers us a lot. So we need to destroy the Black Sea fleet, and we need to cripple their abilities to operate in the Black Sea. So if we're looking at the Black Sea, if you wanted to control all of this territory, well, what are we looking at? The Ottomans held all of this up to right about here. The Russians are going to control some of this stuff, but there's this nice peninsula here that kind of sticks out and is kind of isolated because of the geography and is a potential target, hence Crimean War. So the idea is we're going to attack Crimea, and if we can chop off this peninsula, oh man, we can pretty much dominate the entire Black Sea at that point. Russia's going to be crippled. Was this the start of the Black Sea fleet for the Russia? No. The Russians had a fleet in the Black Sea going back, at this point, almost 150 or so years. They had been floating ships around in the Black Sea for a while, but especially in the late 1700s. No, I guess it couldn't have been 100 years at this point, because it was late 1700s. It was under Catherine the Great. So what would that have been, 1780s and 90s? So for about the last 60 or so years, the Russians had militarized the Black Sea. What's up, hydrocannabinoid? How's it going, man? Not Oman, Crimea. Oh man, ha ha ha. It's pronounced Oman. Catherine is slandered by that, and there is no proof that happened. But I appreciate you knowing the rumors, question mark. Forgive my ignorance, but did Russia have Crimea? Yes, it was at that time Russian. We can go back to our pre-war map. Ba-doop, ba-doop. So Russia at that point is going to hold most of the northern coast of the Black Sea, including the Crimean Peninsula. Ottomans are going to hold most of the rest of the territory. So the Allied forces from the west are planning to attack Russia. Yes, this is an invasion of Russia, specifically targeting the Crimean Peninsula. That is the plan. Riding a horse does not count. Yeah, this is true. That is true. So, we're going to invade. Woo! And this starts in September. And the location that they choose to begin with is going to be a site along the Alma River, which is, if we want to zoom in here, this is a river that runs from these mountains here down to the sea, and they're going to want to attack along the coastline here to be able to use this as a beachhead to attack further into the Crimean Peninsula, and specifically to target a city that is called Sevastopol, which is right here. So we're going to want to get rid of this big port city. So we're going to attack right around here, and they're going to try to use that to spin our way up towards Sevastopol. Now, obviously, the Russians are going to be able to move in reinforcements from the mainland, but this is the plan. The battle at Alma is really, really, really tough. This is in September of 1854, and it's rough. It is going to cost both sides thousands of troops. The Russians are actually kind of caught, not necessarily flat-footed, but they're unexpected. The numbers of the troops that the British and the French and the Ottomans bring is way higher than the Russians expected. And while the Russians are going to have fortified emplacements with cannons and stuff that can shoot down on invaders, the sheer number of overwhelming invaders is going to push them out of Alma, and Russia is going to have to fall back with their forces to Sevastopol. Now, the kicker here is that Sevastopol itself sits on this sort of like natural cut in the, you can see here, the bay, and the city can get reinforced from the northern coast as well. So if you just block off this region right here, you're not really blocking off the city. So to block off this region, you kind of have to start encircling the entire area, and then you have to move your fleet out over here to block people from reinforcing by the water. And this is going to begin the siege of Sevastopol, which is the longest running engagement of the entire war. This is going to start in October of 1854, and what's really going to kill a lot of the momentum is that the Russians decide that instead of losing their ships, what they're going to do is beach them. They're going to pull them up onto the shore, and they're going to basically use the cannon on those ships as defense of the city. So this kind of increases the support that they have, the firepower that they have to hold the city. And at this point, the British and the French are kind of trying to push into this way, but they're not able to completely surround the city. But they're going to keep trying. One of the things that they want to do is try to capture the port. If they could just get to the port part of Sevastopol, that itself would surround a lot of the troops that are in the city part. But to do that, you've basically got to run right down the middle of the Russian defenses. Sevastopol, interesting that Alien referenced this. I do like Alien for the fact that it throws in little history things every now and then, but I don't know exactly how much the history informed the story. That would be a really interesting question to ask Ridley Scott. Like, hey, why did you bring that in? Was there deeper understanding for this? Was there sort of like, a point to it, or was it just cool because it sounds cool? Right. It's just borrowing cool-sounding town names. I don't know if... I'm sure that somewhere somebody has asked Ridley Scott about that. That'd be interesting to read. I wouldn't know what he would say. But anyway. So, to try to take Sevastopol, there are going to be lots of different conflicts that are wrapped up in the siege, because they do start trying to lay siege to the city. They dig in trenches and they dig in lines, and they're going to build military garrisons, and they're going to start building gun emplacements to try to take the city and to try to keep the Russians contained. But the Russians are not contained. It's important to understand that at this point the Russians were not contained. So they're going to try, they being the Allies, are going to try to push for the port. And this is going to begin the Battle of Balaclava. And you're like, that's the little thing that you put on your head. Pretty much, yes. But this particular portion of the siege of Sevastopol was designed at trying to take the port of the city and trying to cut the Russians off from supplies. This is not going to go well for the Allies. This is where we have the very famous charge of the Light Brigade. Yeah, so this one you definitely know. Yeah, so here's the deal. The attempt at cutting Russia off from the port and its supplies was a tough thing to try in the first place, because the Russians, again, were very much dug in and had position superiority. So when the Allied forces start pushing at the beginning of the battle, the Russians are just going to open up with them those big artillery pieces and start blowing the crap out of the Allies, and communication on the field almost immediately breaks down. And this is where the whole charge of the Light Brigade thing starts in the first place, because the field commanders are going to be sort of constantly assailed with failing positions and bad news. And because of this, the chain of command becomes unclear. Nobody really knows who's in charge, and nobody really knows exactly what the orders mean. So this is before we're frequently using telegrams. Now, telegrams did exist at this time, but the battlefield itself wasn't wired for telegrams, so it was pretty much just people running around or people shouting at each other in the middle of a battle. And in the process of this, some of the British soldiers that are in the Light Brigade, which was a mounted horseback unit designed mostly for quick skirmishes, and God forbid you question your orders. Pretty much not something that you do, right? You don't question orders. So in this chaos, one of the head officers gives the order to a junior officer to try to take a particular gun emplacement that is on top of a hill. And it just so happens that thanks to the photographic efforts of a guy named Foreman after the war, we have a picture of this particular battlefield. So you can see here how what we're looking at is sort of this natural draw where you get funneled into this kind of natural draw where you're going to be under the fire of cannons on emplacements upon hills like this. So if you've ever read the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, and you hear about them rushing into the jaws of death, this is what it's talking about. They basically had to charge down this little narrow strip here to try to get at these Russian guns that were shooting at them the whole time. And this was a dumb move. You just don't practically attack that, right? And you don't do that on horseback especially, right? That's just a bad move. But here's the thing. You get told by your officer, you go take that gun emplacement. And they go, with what? We've got sidearms and we've got a few muskets and some rifles and we're on horseback and you're going to have us charge those cannons. And that's the command. You've got to go do it. So here goes the Light Brigade. And they're like 670-ish people. They set off and they charge this gun emplacement. And in the chaos of the battle, what is absolutely fascinating is that they actually managed to get to the guns, and they actually managed to run the Russians off the hill for a little bit. But then they kind of turn around and they look around them, and they're completely surrounded by enemy forces on all sides with absolutely no backup, because nobody in infantry is going to be able to keep up with a cavalry charge. So then they scatter out the Russians from these guns, and then they look around and they go, well, crap, we've got to retreat because nobody else is coming to back us up. Also, nobody really knew that they were going to be there except for the one guy that gave them the order to go take it, because the guy that had initially given the order says that that's not what he meant to do. You know, objective complete, pretty much. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Yes, that's exactly what happened. So they get there, they run the Russians off, they realize that they're surrounded, and then they turn and kind of ride back, the ones that could ride away. It's absolute folly for this whole thing to have happened in the first place. About a third of them are going to be casualties. About 120 of something of them die. They lose half of their horses in the charge, and by the time they get back to the Allied side of things, people had kind of figured out what is going on, because, you know, the guns from that hill had stopped firing on the troops. And then everything sort of just stumbles backwards and dominoes into utter confusion. And at this point, the British leadership understood that they had gone foobar in this whole thing. And they go, okay, battle over, let's just pull back, because we're obviously not going to be able to do what we wanted to do. Now, the Battle of Balaclava is technically indecisive, but let's be real clear here. This is not going to play well in Britain at all. This becomes the ultimate story of people wasting innocent lives, wars being fought for no reason, government overreach, imperial overreach. Palmerston takes a giant hit in this. The French aren't going to come off much better, just being honest. And the Russians are going to be able to get a sort of an emotional victory, because they end up capturing a whole bunch of British cannon. And they parade the cannon around in Sevastopol. These cannons, there are something like 20 of them, I believe. And so the Russians are parading around all these different British guns going, look, we beat the British, look, we beat the British. So even though they didn't really win anything, they got this symbolic victory, and that starts souring everybody's opinion on this war to begin with. Because let's remember, ultimately the British don't really have a reason to invade Russia other than the French and the Ottomans were going to do it, and if you didn't participate, you're not going to get any spoils out of this. Was a few hundred deaths a lot at this time? So a few hundred deaths in one military unit, yes, that was a big deal. There were thousands of people that died in the battle overall because of poor management, garbled communication, utter failure to achieve any sort of cohesion as an effort. The forces of the British and the French and the Ottomans didn't necessarily work very well together. It was a bungle. Nobody thought that this was a good outcome, except maybe some of the Russians, who ultimately didn't break the siege, but got to parade around some captured British artillery pieces. Yes, not to go away from Foreman, who took a lot of these pictures. We actually have here a photograph that Foreman was able to complete and this is 1855. These are survivors of the charge of the Light Brigade. So all of these guys would have been in the Light Brigade during the charge itself. So these people made it back out. I think it's fascinating that we have any of these pictures to begin with, but I always find old photos like this to be especially interesting. So there are some of the 600, right, who charged a Russian gun emplacement and survived. Ever since Napoleon, at least, they kept units alive by pulling them out if possible to preserve them. Yeah, and then you sort of shuffle them around. Non-enemy survivors. So these are the people that would have charged. These people were in the light brigade that survived the charge. So this is a photograph from 1855. Made at the same time that, that's Omar Pasha, that they made this picture, which is, the Valley of Death. Which is kind of a horrible thing to kind of laugh at, but, I mean, it's so stupid to charge down that. Such an idiot decision. Anyway, so I know that the initial request of the stream started from, let's talk about the charge of the Light Brigade. So I wanted to make sure that I gave that enough coverage. So, I mean, those people there weren't the only survivors. Of the entire unit, the majority of them did survive. Those were just the ones that he could find, that he could photograph. I wonder if there are pictures of the Russian survivors of that charge. Probably not, Foggage. But the reason those photographs exist was because of the absolute chaos that this wrought, made. Anyway, the charge of the Light Brigade hit the British newspapers like a storm. And the reason it was so dramatic was that this was so obviously a failure of the command level that cost innocent soldiers, well, I guess innocent soldiers might be a misnomer depending on how you're looking at this, that cost common people their lives, right? And the reason that these photographs exist in the first place was because the fervor around this was so great that people funded Foreman to go back over to Russia to take these pictures in the first place. Pictures and photographs at that time were stupid expensive. And the technology was very, very new. But we can look at these photographs and go like, holy crap, these exist. And the reason that these exist is because the impact that the charge of the Light Brigade and the failure at Balaclava had on the general population of the British Empire. Didn't mean for you guys to actually charge. Yeah, kind of, sort of, right? Those common people should be thankful they got to ride a horse for a minute. You know how expensive horses are. Well, 375 horses died in the charge as well. More horses than people. Get reeked? Yeah, sort of. Rogged? It was bad. After the Battle of Balaclava, the situation is going to sit for a little while, and it's not going to be until November that the Allies try anything else. And the idea, after trying to attack Sevastopol directly, is to try to take some of the surrounding cities, including a little place called Crimean, which we can see up here. So instead of charging directly at the city and trying to take the port, why don't we try to take this position? Because if we can continue to surround them and take this point, we can use that to maybe then move up this way and cut off Russia from this part, and then we can maybe move our fleet in and get right here, right? So Crimean is the strategic position that they want to take, and this is a battle that goes much, much differently. The Allies are going to move much more concertedly. They had received very strict reprimands for the chaos that was Balaclava, and they're going to plan very detailed. They're going to have specific movements, specific positions of capture, who's going to do what, who's going to be in charge of what, da-da-da-da-da. And when they actually work together and coordinate ahead of time, the Battle of Crimean in November of 1854 is very different. They win a very decisive victory, and this is going to force the Russians into a position where they basically have to hunker down in Sevastopol, and it's going to cut off the Russian ability to move from the northern part of the port down here to the south without getting on boats, right? Nothing compares to Okinawa. Yeah, that's bloody and brutal. Some of the worst fighting in World War II, absolutely. What's up, P-Matt? How's it going? Reek Rot suggested leak lot and creek crot. English is so dumb. Our language is so dumb. Ugh. Philology. Anyway, Inkerman, good. Unfortunately for everybody here, the winter of 1854 to 1855 is rough. It started snowing in October, and by the time you get to December, January, and February, it is real bad. The winter is incredibly harsh. There is large amount of snowfall. Communication breaks down. Supply lines break down. Pretty much everybody on both sides is having trouble finding food, having trouble finding enough warm weather, having cold weather clothing to keep themselves warm, and they're having trouble finding stuff to burn to keep fires going. Because we've got two armies in this very narrow area, and they're taking up all of the resources, right? And during this period of time, when we get to especially the sort of the worst part of the war in February, Nicholas gets this idea that the Allies are just so in trouble that there's no way they could hold their position. And Nicholas is convinced by reports from the ground that the Allies are starving to death, that they're failing in their positions, that they don't have any more ammunition, they don't have bullets or anything like that. Now, he shouldn't have been, because it was very obvious that the war wasn't necessarily going that badly for the Allies. There had been theaters of the war going on in different parts over the course of the year. There are battles between, there's a big fort in Finland that the British and the French attack. There are places over in the Pacific that the British and the French attack. So it's not just happening here in Crimea, but those are ultimately very insignificant to the larger portion of the war. So we're going to kind of focus on this. But the Russians think that if they can break out of Sevastopol, that they're going to be able to free that army up and push the Allies out. And they're going to do this by attacking at a place called Eupatoria. I used to be an English tutor, and trying to explain prefixes and suffixes was horrible. Yeah. Technically, dumb language is an oxymoron because it's involving speech, and dumb means without being able to speak. Eupatoria. So, what are we looking at here? We are going to look at Russia that are going to try to attack some positions along the Allied supply lines. And what they're going to do here is hope that if they break the last of the Allied supply lines, the British and the French and the Ottomans are going to have to retreat. Unfortunately, the British and the French and the Ottomans are much better prepared than the Russians think. And when they attack the Allies at Eupatoria, the Allies are able to not just spin the attack and defend it, they're actually able to bring the fight back at the Russians and pretty much destroy this section or this battalion that had been sent to take Eupatoria. And it turns into a ridiculously bad loss for the Russians. And they had already lost a lot of face in this whole thing. They had not been able to win like they thought they should have. They had been pushed out of the Balkans. It was becoming a very obvious thorn in Nicholas's side. So Nicholas gets word that Eupatoria goes bad, and he doesn't survive 2 months after this, and he ends up dying. He was not necessarily a young man, but this wasn't something that they were expecting. Nobody expected Nicholas to just keel over dead, but this was not a good point for him. So we're going to get a new Tsar, and this is Alexander II. So obviously we can get photographs of this guy because we're now sort of in photograph world. What up, Lofta? Good to see you. So Alexander II becomes Tsar, and now he's kind of got something to prove. Because Dad's dead, he's a new Tsar, he can't just do nothing, right? So what he's going to do is open a new front in the war. And this is a very, very tricky thing to do here. But he decides that what he's going to do is attack through the Caucasus and into the Ottoman Empire. So if he can bring an army this way, he's hoping that he can draw Ottoman forces out of Crimea and back over here to protect their flank. Because invading the Ottomans is going to up the pressure. And he chooses a particular city called Kars. And I get to put on the adventure hat. Because I have been to Kars. So this is the adventure hat. And if I show you pictures of places that I have been, or things that I have seen, I get to put on the adventure hat, and we'll share some adventure hat emotes. Gary Newman was a fan of Kars because I've been to the fortress of Kars. And here it is. It is still there today. You can go visit. It's a pretty neat castle. Obviously, this is going to be one of the targets of the Russians. The Ottoman forces that are going to be stationed here in Kars are actually led by some British officers. So there's British officers and some support staff here, but most of the troops are Ottomans. And you can see here pretty big walls, nice place to hide. Fortress. Did I say fortress? Oh, fortress, because it's a car. Ha 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 ha. Yeah, they did build stuff to last back then. Absolutely. This fort was actually much older and had been built a long, long time ago. Just around the corner from this particular location, there's actually a very old fortress of Urartu, a kingdom that we talked about last week when we were talking about the Scythians. So this is sort of old Urartu. So this particular location and the valley that it protects has been strategic for a long, long time. But anyway, I figured this would be funny too because I can share this photo because I thought it would be funny to sit on the cannon. So there's me with the adventure hat. I was actually sick as a dog when I took that photo. I had a massive amount of gastronomic distress, and this day was already starting off rough. We'll just say it that way. But I needed something to laugh at. So there's me on top of a cannon. But anyway, the siege at Kars is going to be an interesting one because it's going to start in June, and it ultimately doesn't have the effect that the Russians were hoping, because they think, oh man, this is going to draw all of the Ottoman forces away, and they're going to have to retreat from Crimea, and they're going to have to come over here to stop our forces. But that sort of, you have to continue to take land to be a continued threat. If you're sieging a fortress and you're not moving anywhere, as long as the people inside of it can hold out, you're just going to kind of let them hold out. So the invasion of the Ottoman Empire and the siege at Kars does not have the desired effect. And at that point, Alexander is getting desperate. You got to do something. You've got to try to do something to get a win. And even if you can get one win and then use that win to say, haha, we can beat you, now you have to negotiate with us on better terms. Even if you can get one big win in, you can dramatically change the landscape of any sort of peace discussions. So you got to get something. And this is going to trigger the Battle of Chernaya, which is sort of like the last really big battle of the war. Yeah, don't try this at home, kids. So this is another attempt at breaking the supply lines for the Allied troops that were sieging Sevastopol. And the Russians are going to put together pretty much all that they can in a really big attempt at sort of running the Allies off. Crimea does not go well for them. Not only do they lose with an immense number of casualties. And the number of casualties that they take is so large that the British and Ottoman and French forces are convinced at that point that Sevastopol is effectively unguarded. And this is going to trigger the end of the siege of Sevastopol. Battle of Crimea, by the way, is in August. Over the course of the next few months, the Allies are going to figure out that Sevastopol's defenses are very, very weak. And by the time we get to the end of August, the Allies are going to push into Sevastopol, and they're going to take the city. And this is a giant humiliation for the Russian forces. Can't believe you remember all this off the top. I forget how old I am some days. Well, I mean, so just to be completely transparent, Puckface, I know this story and I could tell it to you, but I do have this guide, right? I have an outline, and I typed this for myself yesterday morning, just to make sure that I have a narrative. But I sat down and I typed this just to make sure that I was going to be able to say this in a narrative way. This is a closed book test. I mean, I could do it without the notes, but what would end up happening is that I would tangent off so frequently that I would never get anything done. I would end up talking about everything else. I'd still be talking about Urartian forces in the region and pulling up photos and going, let me show you Urartu. What's up, Nogurt? I try to forget how old you are some days. Foggage wants us to get on with it. Moose is going to throw a tangent. What up, Frank? How's it going, man? Yeah, I would tangent off to stuff that's completely different and not related at all. Anyway, so Sevastopol falls. This is uber humiliating for the Russians. And at this point, pretty much everybody wants to quit fighting. Now, the Russians are still going to hold on, and they do actually manage to take the city of Kars in November of 55. But they lose so many men in the process that they really don't have anything to brag about. The people in the fortress at Kars had held out to the point that they were literally starving. They had run completely out of food. They were so malnourished that they could barely even stand. The reports of the British officer that was in charge there said that when the Russians showed up, they thought that they were going to get a whole bunch of people that they were going to turn around and use as slaves. And they ended up having to carry these people out of the fort because they literally couldn't get up and walk out of the fort. So the siege at Kars was won by the Russian forces, but it ultimately didn't give them this sort of big hoorah thing that they were looking for. So at this point, the only person that really feels like it's time to keep going is Palmerston. At this point, Palmerston was sort of convinced that the Allied forces could kind of just roll up the entire coastline of the Balkans side of the Mediterranean. I'm sorry, not the Mediterranean. The Balkan side of the Black Sea and the Asian side of the Black Sea, and push Russia completely off, and then turn back around and maybe even invade north towards some of the big cities in southern Russia. But everybody else in Britain was done with it. France was done with it, and the Ottomans were definitely done with it. So the French are going to be kind of sneaky here, and the French are going to actually start trying to negotiate with Russia without even really telling the British, because the French are kind of done at this point. They're like, yeah, this has sucked, and we don't want to be involved in this war anymore. So the Ottomans are not necessarily involved in the early part of the peace dealings either. They just call the Russians to Paris and go, "Hey, you got to quit." And Alexander is like, "Yeah, we got to quit. So what are the terms?" And the Ottomans and the British show up after the negotiations have kind of already started, and the French are just like, "Oh, I didn't tell you that we're ending the war. We're totally ending the war." And the British and the Ottomans are kind of like, "Yeah, okay, cool. We don't, yeah, whatever." So here are the terms. First off, the Ottomans get all of their territory back. The Austrians got to bugger off of Wallachia and Moldavia, and the Russians have to pull all of their army out of the Ottoman Empire over by Kars, and Kars goes back to the Ottomans. Okay, cool. The Russians don't like that, but that's what it is. Russia has to demilitarize the Black Sea. Now, this was a smaller sting than it had been at the end of 1853, because at this point, most of the Black Sea fleet had been destroyed anyway, or grounded in Sevastopol. So it wasn't like they had overwhelmingly large Black Sea forces of Navy anyway, but they couldn't sail vessels of war into the Black Sea. Also, the French get what they were after to begin with. Russia has to give up all claims of protecting Christianity in the Ottoman Empire, especially in the Holy Land. And France gets that as their bonus. So that's the end of the Crimean War, and this gets all wrapped up in 55 and then signed in 56. But that doesn't end the story, because there's another Russo-Turkish War after this, and of course then there's all the stuff in World War I and blah, 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 blah. And it's all part of the larger story. But that's the Crimean War. Ultimately is going to kill thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Nobody really came out of this with unqualified wins. The British are going to come out of this way worse than they probably expected. The Ottoman Empire survives, but the British people are very much ticked off at the way that the war effort went, and very, very much ticked off at the leadership for all of this stuff. Russia went to war again because they didn't get spoils. Russia goes to war again because they're Russia. And ultimately, they want what they want, and they're not going to take no for an answer. So, in fairness, we always are. Is that British people are always mad at the government? Perhaps. Perhaps so. Right now, I suspect there are many reasons to be angry with your government, just as there are many reasons to be angry with most governments right now. But that is the Crimean War. And I hope that sufficiently covered the charge of the Light Brigade for, I think Matt was actually the one that recommended that. But I hope that this answered the question of what is the Crimean War? Why was it fought? What was the outcome? What were the processes? So, there we go. This was a good one, and I like this one a lot. I was really excited to dig into this one. Because this is sort of that history that gets glossed over a lot and doesn't actually get discussed a lot. So, all right. So if anybody has any additional questions, or anybody wants to redeem any channel point stuff, you can do that. You learned a bunch that you didn't know. That's great. Russians looked around at that death and destruction and went, okay, sure, let's do that again in just like 3 or 4 years. What were those original terms again? Yeah, pretty much. And there's a lot more stuff that we could have talked about. Again, the war didn't just happen in this area. I left out the Atlantic Theater and the Baltic Theater and the Pacific Theater, but ultimately they were very, very small and did not greatly contribute to the overall war effort. Current-day Russia follows Soviet instruction, which is to restore as much as possible of the empire as possible. And that's definitely Putin's motivation. He definitely wants to... He definitely wants to restore the old Russian Empire. But, you know, hopefully we don't have to worry with that. Possibly. Yeah. Putin is a weird little guy. All right, so one thing we definitely need to do, does he want to restore it or be seen to restore it? Yes to both, Lopta. Yes to both. And he definitely wants to be the one that does it, for sure. Yes, Maddie. I'm sorry, you're not. We have another person that used to come in called Maddie, but Matt. Yes, this is where Florence Nightingale does a lot of her stuff, and I completely omitted her from the story, not because I felt like she wasn't involved with it, but under the understanding that we can't cover everything, and if people were interested, we could do viewer request on her as an individual. The interview with Tucker was concerning. Every time he speaks, it is concerning. There was a significant Bronze Age conflict that was explicitly over access to copper. Was there a significant Bronze Age conflict that was explicitly over access to copper? Not explicitly. There were many that involved access to copper. Fogage, both Putin and Tucker. Copper obviously was a big deal, and there obviously was copper deposits, and because bronze was copper and tin, you had to have access to both of them. But I can't think of a specific war that was fought over just copper stuff. Most of it had to do with general trade, copper being one of the trade goods. Some of it was just religious, and some of it was just grievance, especially back in the Bronze Age. A lot of the early Bronze Age stuff has to do with regional differences in things like religion. Each city kind of had its own god, and you had to go conquer for your god. But at that time, everything was sort of being directed by priesthoods kind of stuff. But, that's Bronze Age stuff, which I'd be happy to talk about if that's what anybody wanted. All right, so the Crimean War was a purchase stream, so we need to run a poll. So let's do this before we sneak off. Oh yeah, we could talk about ancient Egypt expanding for sure. So there are two different ways we do viewer requests. One of them is by people purchasing it through point request, and we alternate. So the point redemption was by Matt, who wanted to talk about the Crimean War, so we did. So now we need a poll. So what we're going to do, anybody in the chat that has a specific topic about something that you want to talk about, put it in chat, and then I'll pick 4 that are listed, and then we'll vote on them, and it'll be our next viewer request stream. So if you got an idea, throw that stuff in chat. I was listening to a podcast today about an Iron Age site probably less than a mile from the village you were born in. Interesting. Robot ducks, not a good historical topic. Interesting topic, but I don't know enough about robot ducks to say anything about. So, Eleanor of Aquitaine, good old standby, eh? Moose has tried to get her like 17 times. It's going to be really hard to do something specifically just about paintings. Mostly because, I don't know if I can find enough about them as an individual thing to get enough material about that. We've done Japanese art before. The Great Game. Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, Tuna, I don't legitimately know if I can find enough information about that. And I definitely don't know enough about that off the top of my head. All right, catching up with chat. Great game. New Zealand Wars. We could do that. One day, Eleanor Vacatane and artists. We've done the Emu War already. Islam in Europe. So that one's a bit broad. You'd have to give me a specific clarifier. We've talked about Arianism before, and we've talked about Nestorianism before, but not specifically one stream about that. We could do one on early church heresies. And we can sort of lump those in together. All right, so here we go. So here's our poll. So everybody can vote. If you go into chat, there's a little down arrow at the top of chat, and everybody gets to vote. And honestly, this light bulb is sort of like fuzzing on me real quick, so let me put up the break screen. Everybody gets to vote, and I'm going to try to fix this real quick, and then I'll come back after the vote, and we'll be good. Just a second. Okay, so I guess we're going to do Eleanor. That's cool. I I don't know what's up with this light bulb, by the way. It's doing this weird thing where it's flickering and making these these buzzy noises, and I don't like that when it comes to electrical stuff. Tolkien's art. Well, we could have done that one. Workers' movements, communism, Islamic Robodoc. For anyone, the great game in history is espionage, mostly between Russia and England, church heresies. What's it like to be a heretic? I live my life as a heretic most days. I heard you get chased by the Astartes or American politicians. Shane must have broken all the lights in his house. No. So I don't. I've got these light umbrellas, and they have fluorescent light bulbs in them, and the light bulbs themselves are, I guess, not necessarily old, but they're plastic housing is fragile or something. So one of them has the little the plastic housing is broken a little bit, and I don't know. I guess I need to try to super glue it back together, or maybe something like that. You're going to vote for the heresies, but you always watched a 5-hour-long 40K lore video. Yeah, there you go. Ghost infestation. Time to replace them with LEDs. Lopta, that's on the list. The issue there is man, LED bulbs are pricey. They're coming down in cost, but they are pricey. Maybe that's what I should spend the next Twitch check on, is some LED bulbs. Signed languages. Got to remember to suggest that next time, or maybe Galio they. Definitely Ghost. Yeah. Dispose of them carefully because of the mercury. What's up, Square? How's it going? Do I have a Dollar Tree? I do have a Dollar Tree nearby. The question is, do they have bright LEDs that would be equivalent to the super bright stuff that I have here to balance out the light? So a lot of the stuff like the generic plug into your overhead light bulb doesn't have the same number of lumens as these super bright fluorescents that I use to try to get the light balance working in here. LED is still worth it. Their lifespan makes it worth it unless you buy IKEA. I don't even know where the nearest IKEA is to me. So, what's in the news? I don't know. Do you want me to talk about something specific? Yes, they have 100-watt equivalent. Interesting, PMAT. Thanks for the tip. I might sneak out tomorrow and give those an eyeball. We do have a Lowe's nearby, Lopta. I can also check that out. Maybe I'll do a little shopping trip tomorrow. I'm going to go shopping for light bulbs. That's super exciting, right? Tuna, did you have anything specific that you wanted me to talk about, or did you just want me to pick something and talk about it? If you want to buy something bright, look at a colder color temperatures, like a blue. Well, the situation that I run into is that I need to put something back here that's colored, like a color light. This looks somewhat warm because the wall behind it is a warmer color of beige. But what I would eventually like to do is get some LED strips that might run either around this way and then across and then down, or that would run under the bottom of these shelves that are here and here. Or if I could get an LED strip that would go here, that might do something like like a blue or a green, maybe, or maybe even a little bit more of an orange, perhaps. That would kind of balance the color out a little bit. You get a lot more brightness for the same. But anyway, the whole point is like the stuff behind me is very, very bright, and I'm working with what I have. So for the light balance on the camera to work out, the stuff that's in front of me needs to be very, very bright as well. And I can tell you that the temperature in this room when I run all of this stuff is significantly higher than the rest of the house. Either you missed my joke or it missed you. I guess so. I mean, you redeemed it, so I guess I still want to try to address that if I can. Also, Caldillo still has an opinion hat from last stream. If Caldillo is still around, if you've come up with something you want my opinion on, we can hold it again, or I can redeem it for you if you want. Have I done an episode on the seven ancient wonders? I have not. That'd be an interesting episode. I can pick. Something in the news equals the Crimean War. Yeah. My nearest IKEA is in Atlanta or Memphis. Hey, nothing like driving for hours and hours and hours. So I guess we could talk about European elections that happened this week in the last round of EU elections. There were some fairly dramatic changes in countries' representations to the EU. Most notably, France elected a lot more people in the National Rally, which is kind of like their fascist party. And the German AfD now controls about 17% of the German delegation to the European Union. Both of those are not good. The response from Macron, the current leader in France, was to hold snap elections, which I don't think are going to go well for him. Especially today, with some news coming out about some of the people that are currently in coalition with Macron saying that it might be time to be open to a coalition with the National Rally. I don't think that Macron's going to be in charge for much longer. Worry about your own elections? Yeah, I mean, Trump's going to get reelected. I've been saying that now for like years. Marine Le Pen is scary. Yeah, she for real is. Not as openly anti-Semitic or fascist as her dad, but probably just as quietly anti-Semitic and fascist as her dad. Snap elections are always a great idea. Yeah, pretty much. EU wants to be America so badly and not in a good way. I don't think that the EU wants to be America. I think that they want to be in the position that America is in. And I think that's an important distinction to make. I don't think that they want to be America exactly. I just think that they want to be the perceived leader of the free world. The EU very badly does not want to be America. Yeah. Now, to be clear, the overall, like the EU Parliament has 720 something members, and centrist parties across the board did maintain a majority. So there are not going to be overwhelmingly dramatic shifts across the board in the EU. But I do think that the political situation in France is far more disturbing than Macron seems to think that it is. And I also think that Scholz's days in Germany are numbered. No, you're good. You're good. It's all good. Nobody's pointing fingers or getting mad at anybody in here. America is a place of lots of population and lots of land and lots of money and lots of promise and also lots of dumb. Lots of bad decisions, lots of decisions made out of fear, right? Instead of out of reason. And that's what ends up getting us in trouble a lot of times. We get led by the fear, and what that ends up doing is making us make irrational and illogical decisions. I mean, that's why we're going to re-elect Trump, just to be honest. Why do I think fascism is on the rise? What up, Kahini? So I think right now what we are witnessing is a bit of a pendulum effect. So if we look at what happened in the early 2000s and early 2010s, we saw the pendulum shift very far to what we could say like our small L liberal policies in a lot of places. We saw a lot of people having more open democracies. We saw a lot of people having more freedoms distributed to them. We saw a breakdown of some of the last kind of big centralized authority kind of things. Like we see a lot more territories taking over their own governing stuff. And we saw people like, European populations that had previously been under a lot of very strict conservative governments move towards more open governments. And when that happens on a global scale, the people that are older, specifically the people that are fully adults and in charge, get freaked out because the world is shifting away from what they thought. And that makes them very uncomfortable. So you have this, like if your pendulum swings this way, then the pendulum has to swing back that way. And I think that we are on kind of the apex, or maybe just below the apex of the swing back. And I think that it's probably going to get worse. I think that next year is going to be really, really bad. And I think the year after that is likely to be pretty, really bad. And then by probably 3 to 4 years, we'll start seeing the pendulum swing back in the other direction. The problem now is that a lot of the world has sort of thought that nothing really matters if it doesn't affect them directly. Younger people today are in a position where they are capable of having this very interconnected life without understanding how much interconnectivity affects them. And because they're not seeing immediate effects of a lot of this stuff, they're not really aware that they have to do things like vote. And, changing your Facebook or your Instagram picture to thoughts and prayers doesn't actually accomplish political ends. Getting off your butt and organizing votes and going to vote and pushing for stuff is what's required. And it's going to have to get very, 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 very uncomfortable for some of these people to realize that they're part of the problem by just running their mouths about it and not acting about it. Old folks fear change. That's true, for sure. If you've lived your entire life in one way for, 60 years, you don't want that to change. That's what you're comfortable with, right? Along those lines, why is the gender political divide growing so rapidly? Part of that has to do with the swing back as well. You saw a lot of world leaders getting elected that were women, and you saw a lot of gender equality stuff happening during that same early 2000s to early 2010s period. And the swing back is always going to be against that. So you're going to see, instead of things like expansions of marriage rights, you're going to see restrictions on marriage rights. And of seeing expansion or protection of abortion rights, you're going to see restriction of abortion rights and stuff like that. It's the back and the forth. But in Germany, it's the young people voting for the Nazi party. See, the thing is what they're doing is they're not actually voting intelligently. They are voting out of a false sense of reality. and they don't actually know what they're voting for because they're not voting for stuff, they're voting against something. They're voting against the establishment because the current leadership of Europe in general has been very ignorant of how to play their cards the right way. And instead of recognizing that they had momentum on liberal policies and doing things that were not going to alienate conservative populations overall, they kind of went for the jugular and then put their boot on their throats and humiliated them. And what that means is there's going to be a vision that the people that are in charge are the bad guys, regardless of what their policies are, and regardless of what they're actually doing. They're just perceived as the bad guy. So you vote against the people that are most obviously vocally against the current bad guy, which means that you end up voting for people like the AfD. The moral arc of your universe sounds short and chaotic. It can be. Have you ever heard "Vote Baby Vote" by D-Light? I haven't heard that song. I've heard "Groove Is in the Heart," but I haven't heard "Vote Baby Vote." Party doesn't even have a candidate anymore on voting day. Yeah, see, that's the thing. Like, they're not voting for a person. They're voting for that idea that's counter the idea in... Humble request for one example of put boot on throat and humiliated. So when there were debates in France about stuff like the retirement age, and the people in France said, we don't like this and you shouldn't do it. Macron's government said, we're gonna do it. And we really don't care about your concerns, and we really don't care about what you think about this, because this is what we think is going to be right. And it's fair to point out that the calculations that the French retirement age were based on were done by Macron's supporting group and sort of tailored to fit the idea that they needed to raise the retirement age. And instead of listening to what was obviously a majority of the population saying, hey, we really don't want you to do this, Macron's government said, middle finger, we're going to do it anyway, and then you're going to like it because we're doing this for you. And they didn't have to do that. If they needed to raise the retirement age, they might have, sure, right? The population of every country is getting older, but the way that they did it was designed to show that they had the power and that nobody else did. And when you tell people, we got elected by you and you gave us the power, so F you, we don't really care about what you say anymore because we're now elected, that's not a good way to build a good rapport with the population that is that's supposed to be represented by your activities. I checked 2 places where you voted, and in both places there was a wacky right-wing candidate. In the United States, almost all politicians seem to be, with respect to the globe, right-wing conservatives, with the exceptions of very few moderates. Yeah, so PMAT, the thing about the United States is that, in general, we are more conservative in policy than a lot of places are. And if you took someone that was a conservative in somewhere like maybe, I don't know, like a French conservative person, that person in America would probably not be considered conservative. They would probably be considered like middle left, right? Because despite the fact that people in America like to say that every person that's Democrat is a socialist, the number of people that are actually socialists in America that are Democratic is very, very small, right? If you look at the number of politicians that are actively and openly socialist, you're looking at people like Bernie Sanders, right? Who even the left say is too far left. Bernie Sanders, if you took him to somewhere like France, or somewhere like Germany, Bernie Sanders would probably be somebody just to the left of center. Just to be honest. Because a lot of the stuff that Bernie Sanders talks about wouldn't be accepted by European socialists. It just wouldn't happen. If the French retirement age was at 60. I'm not sure exactly where it was, Diviner. I was just giving a specific example because one was asked for. I bet it didn't help that Macron is in his 40s. Macron is not as capable of a politician as he thinks that he is. And that's one of his biggest problems. That's absolutely a mortifying thought, that most people in America are actually way more conservative. Socialists, for the most part, are not let into office by the parties. Pretty much. Did you see the pendulum swing consistently throughout history? Yes. The pendulum swings consistently throughout history. It happens all the time. All the time. You see things like, if we go back to the Roman Republic, you see swings of power between the upper class and the populist movements, right? That's the pendulum of Roman Republic. You'll see the patricians get really uppity and push a lot of stuff and put their boots on the throat of the neck of the plebeians, and then the plebeians will say, forget you, we quit, and they'll walk out of Rome and sit on the hills and stare at everything as it collapses. And then the patricians will have to roll back and allow the plebeians to have more power, or they'll create the tribune of the plebs, or they'll open up some of the lower level priesthoods to plebeians, or they'll create courts that allow plebeians to sit in judgment over those courts. So the pendulum is a constant thing. When did conservative just mean whatever it means now? Originally in the United States, didn't conservative not just mean one thing? So yeah, the difference is where capital C or little c. Are we talking about conservatives like in the capital C? Because now that's effectively Republican, which it shouldn't be. And then we have big L and little l liberals. Now if you say liberal, you pretty much mean Democrat, but that's not what it's supposed to be. Liberalism is an idea that things should change to create more freedom. That very basically is what liberal means. And conservative means that things should stay the same to protect the freedoms that exist. And that's pretty much what it means, or the system that exists as it is. So that's like the conservative versus liberal thing. But if you look at the way that those words have been used throughout history, they have all changed, and they've meant very different stuff. And what's really fascinating now, if you found a conservative, and I do this sometimes in my history classes when I teach them, or sometimes in my sociology classes as well, I'll describe certain values, and I'll have people that have self-identified as conservative, and they'll go, yeah, that sounds great. And then I'll go, well, guess what? Those ideas are classically liberal ideas. And they're like, oh, I'm not a liberal. And I'm like, well, you just agreed with liberalism as it's described in the French political theory that came about because of the invention of liberalism, right? But anyway. So to corporate stuff. Philosopher, what's up, man? We were talking about the Crimean War. We're just sort of shooting the breeze now, talking about whatever. Hearing the French try to explain Americans freaking out about Bernie Sanders being socialist was quite amusing. Yeah, because he's not really very socialist at all. What would a little c conservative Democrat look like? So a Democrat that was looking at maintaining current values would be somebody that would be very angry about the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade, because that was an elimination of a freedom, and they don't like that. They want to maintain the freedoms that exist. They would look at making sure that current support systems were well funded. They would want to make sure that education was very strong. where a small c conservative Democrat might venture away from the rest of their more liberal party, a small c conservative Democrat might say stuff like, we don't really need to raise taxes. What we need to do is spend the money that we have more wisely and more effectively. We need to eliminate waste instead of raising taxes. And we also need to do stuff like we need to look at how we can better implement the stuff that we have on the books now. So instead of saying something like we need to expand welfare, a small c conservative Democrat might say, well, maybe we don't need to expand Medicare. What we need to do maybe is work on the existing healthcare system and make sure that it is properly pricing things and make sure that people have equal access to that based on our current system. So they would run afoul of a lot of the more liberal policies. Here we're talking about small L liberal. That would be looking at changing things to make things better, whereas they would be looking at keeping the current system but making it work more thoroughly and more effectively for their particular social issues like abortion or healthcare or education. You find this very annoying with the words constantly changing? Yes, I agree. Obama was surprisingly conservative. In many ways, he was. Small c conservative. In many ways, he really was. Don't you call you a liberal? Who are you calling a liberal? Right, exactly. U.S. has a terrifying amount of national debt, corporate corruption, higher average starter debt. The EU is on the same path. The EU has a crazy amount of debt as well, and massive amounts of corporate corruption. There are plenty of examples that you could look at for corporate corruption, especially with look, if you want specifically for corporate corruption, look at the contracts that went to companies in Europe that were tasked with helping to rebuild Greece after the Greek bailout. Look at those countries or look at those corporations and see to whom they're connected. I want to conserve the U.S. Constitution. What does that make me? It depends on how you interpret the Constitution. At the time, socialism was pretty mainstream in France. Yes, indeed. Constitution is guaranteed. There's no need to defend it. Ooh, interesting point. That's a hot take. That's classic. How dare you educate me to vote on my ideals and not a political party? You're right. There's a lot of movements that are trying to emulate the U.S. policies in Europe. There are. Eliminating taxes on ultra-wealthy. Exactly. For-profit healthcare, for sure. No big changes away from the things that we have and like. To a certain extent, depending on what we're looking at. Okay, cool. Lots of talky. Constitutional changes need 2/3 acceptance to... Well, I mean, that's the way that it is here, too, right? For any amendment to be added to the Constitution, it has to have 2/3 of states. All right. I think it is time for us to go ahead and raid. My voice is getting a bit scratchy, and I don't like the way that Twitch has changed the raid stuff. Because it's made it harder to find the people that I want to raid. We're going to go raid Aristotle because he's raided me twice in like the last 2 weeks. And he's a cool guy. So did I hit the button to actually raid him? No. Say Twitch has changed the way that we do raids now. So crazy times. They ignore the Constitution when it's convenient, for sure. People act as if things aren't taken and changed by force all the time. They are, for sure. So we're going to go raid Aristotle. If you like talking intelligent stuff, hang around with Aristotle. He's a philosophy PhD. He's a really smart guy. Good friend. Super interesting chatter. So we'll go hang out. Thank you all for hanging out and for bringing the good questions, as always. It's always fun to have the back and forth, right? So thanks to everybody that is subscribed. You can see their cool badges by their names, but also thanks to everybody that is supporting me in other ways. You can see people on Patreon that support me on Patreon there. You can see people that have generously donated books to my giant stack of books to read. I appreciate everybody supporting me through those efforts as well. But until Thursday, hope everybody has a good one, and I will see you around.